So I did my test analysis on the Woodcock-Johnson. I chose this test because it is the one most often given at the high school level in my experience, and the one most often referred to in PPTs. So I wanted to kind of delve a little bit further into the different aspects of the test and how to score it and what you would use it for in terms of objective development and learning goal development. So the test covers general cognitive abilities, a wide range of abilities and skills, both on the academic level and cognitive functioning. It's made up of 22 different sections that helps to identify learning problems. It can identify strengths and weaknesses in each type of content area and leads to more targeted intervention. It can be administered with the following tests. So you can do a standard battery of questions or the extended battery. And the new format, which is titled the Woodcock-Johnson 4, includes domain-specific aptitude clusters, which allow for predictions of academic achievement. And then there's a separate oral language standard battery and oral language clusters. The purpose of the test is to test a specific set of skills. So it's looking at comprehension knowledge, long-term retrieval, visual spatial thinking, auditory processing, fluid reasoning, processing speed, short-term memory, quantitative knowledge, and reading-writing ability. It is therefore a valuable diagnostic tool that can be used by special education teachers and other relevant stakeholders to identify both exceptional students, so those that fall under the gifted and talented category, and then also students with high incidence disabilities, anything from like ADHD, to auditory or visual processing issues, or even disabilities caused by injury like chronic concussions or epilepsy. It covers a wide variety of subject areas, but specifically focuses on English language arts, and math. The subtests can be focused specifically on the different types of batteries available. So the standard battery, there are 11 tests that include letter word identification, applied problems, spelling, passage comprehension, calculation, writing samples, word attack, oral reading, which is new for the fourth iteration of the WJ, sentence reading fluency, math facts fluency, and writing fluency. So again, this just covers ELA and math, but various aspects of those two subject areas. The extended battery is another 9 tests, and it covers reading recall, number matrices, though both of those are new to the fourth iteration of the test, editing, word reading fluency, which is another new test option for the new iteration of the WJ, spelling of sounds, reading vocabulary. 18 is science, 19 is social studies, and 20 is humanities. Now, in my experience, I've only ever seen the utilization of the standard battery of tests. I've never actually had a special education teacher reference any of these extended battery tests when talking about students. That could be because at high school, students are not typically initially diagnosed. It actually seems, in my opinion, very rare that diagnoses typically occur in the elementary, intermediate, and at the very latest, the middle school level. I appreciate that the extended battery includes science, social studies, and humanities, and this is something that I actually mention in my weaknesses area. When I get to that slide, I'll kind of go a little bit more into that. The subtests also include these domain-specific clusters. Now, this is specific to the WJ4, which is the new iteration of this test, and it takes the different kinds of questions from the other subtests but reorganizes them into clusters. There's a lot more overlap with these domain-specific areas, but instead of focusing, let's say, on math attack specifically, we're now looking at like their problem-solving ability, so looking at just from a different lens. And then when we're just looking at the oral language tests, the standard battery includes 9 sets of tests. Picture vocabulary, oral comprehension, segmentation, rapid picture name and sentence repetition, understanding directions, sound blending, retrieval fluency, and sound awareness. For the oral language clusters, which most of these tests are new to the fourth iteration of the WJ, but we do listening comprehension, broad oral language, speed of lexical access, phonetic coding, vocabulary, and then oral language, broad oral language, oral expression, listening comprehension. The ones that are listed as Spanish are especially important for ELLs. It helps us to understand their ability to understand language in their native tongue, which gives us a frame of reference for their ability to transition to English. Is their reading level in their native language on grade level or age appropriate, or is it underdeveloped? Because then when we look at how they're learning English, that's going to impact their learning ability based off of their reading and understanding of language in their native language. So the length of the test, each of those subtests are actually pretty short. They typically only take 5 minutes per test, but total can take 60 to 90 minutes to administer. From what I understand, most special ed teachers will take 2 sessions, 2 one-hour sessions to administer the entire thing. The cognitive set of tests is 35 to 45 minutes, and the achievement standard is 55 to 65 minutes. The population age range, you can test someone as young as 2 all the way up through late adulthood. So there's no limitation on when you can use this particular test. The types of scores. So this test produces 3 score values: a level of development, comparison with peers, and degree of proficiency. The level of development focuses on the age equivalency and grade equivalency. So first is a student's performance in relation to the normative range for that age. Are they performing in the norm level for their age? And then are they performing in the norm level for their grade? And that's a really important distinction, because you can then identify any correlation between that student and the normative range for a particular age. Like if they're 8 years old but they're working at a 6-year-old level, it provides some connection, which may or may not be the same as their grade equivalent. In comparison with their peers, there's a standard score and a percentile rank. So the standard score is the student's performance relative to the average performance of the comparison group. The scale is the same as the IQ test. 100 is the average, and then there's a standard deviation above and below the average. That's 15 points. And on a later slide, I'll show a bell curve and kind of get into that a little bit further. The percentile rank is a student's relative standing to their peers on a scale of 1 to 100. So like if we say a student is in their 80th percentile, that means that they perform better than 80% of their peers on that particular test. The degree of proficiency we call RPI. This is useful in predicting a student's ability to adjust to a particular academic program, because it helps to predict a child's level of proficiency on tasks that a typical age or grade peer would perform with 90% proficiency. So it kind of gives us kind of a predictive measure, so we can use that almost as a guide to create our learning objectives. Whether it's predicting that they're going to be at X position in their reading comprehension by this particular age or grade, well then that gives us an area for growth in that particular subject. Scoring is specific to each test but follows similar format. So a correct answer is marked as a 1, incorrect answers are marked as 0, and the test will continue for each section until the student gets 6 questions wrong in a row, and then you tally up the total number of questions that they got correct, and then you take that number and it's out of whatever the total number of question was for that test. And there is a normative number of questions for each grade and each age for each specific test. And that gives you a kind of a frame of reference for where they fall. Scoring for the WJ4 is done entirely online, and they encourage you to use their data management tool. As far as I know, a lot of special ed teachers that have done the WJ often enough still score it by hand. Even the 4th iteration, they'll do that. This is an example of a teacher-made academic achievement table. So for each one of these categories, the teacher will record their standard score. And here you can see the standard score up above, and this kind of gives you, it's a non-bell curve section, but it follows the bell curve example. So here's 100 is the average right down the middle, and then the scoring ranges here above and below 100 help to give more of a visual representation of where each student lies. If they're in this white section, then yeah, they're performing relatively on average. And then in the gray or dark gray areas are either the far below or far above sides of the bell curve. If we were to put this into a physical picture, it would look like this. So we have the average score here in the middle. Most students fall within this range, and then any performance below or above this average represents either gifted and talented or special needs. Having visualizations like this for parents is also helpful. So whether it's using this kind of table or utilizing this sort of graph to illustrate to parents where students fall under, it helps them to visualize kind of where their child falls within these certain performance indexes. All right, so technical adequacy. So the norms for this test. The standardization measured using a partial matrix sampling with almost 7,500 participants in the sample. So they tested 7,500 participants of various age ranges, and then they standardized their scoring based on a partial matrix. What that means is that 100% of the participants cannot do 100% of the test. It's too time consuming. So they gave different groups of the test to different participants, and that's why we call it a partial matrix sampling. And they standardized the scores based on this. The final data set was used to develop this norm development for each test, and that's used when testing other students, so it's our comparison factor. The norming sample was representative according to U.S. Census data projects. So when we're looking at census data, and then we look at the sample of those tested, they are representative of the national population. And that means that when we go and test a student and we compare their score to the norm sample, we're comparing them to a statistically representative subset of the population. The reliability included both internal consistency and test-retest consistency. So internal consistency, we're talking about acceptable to excellent range for all untimed tests with dichotomously scored items. Excellent range for tests with multi-point items, and the WJ4 has the greatest reliability, especially with the cluster scores. When we talk about internal consistency, that means that any question or projected outcome for the sets of questions are consistent between tests, so that when you're testing reading comprehension in one section, and then you go and test reading comprehension in another section, the questions are consistent in styling and in goal, so that there's reliability within the test. Test-retest means that when you test it with one group and then you retest it with another group, you're getting similar outcomes. So that means that the test is testing what it's designed to test. This was specifically done for timed sections, and they found an acceptable to excellent rate for this level of reliability. So this means that there's stability within the test, especially with the WJ4, the most recent iteration. Having stability within the test means that there is more reliability in the responses. Now, and related to reliability, we have validity, is how valid is this test? There are three different things: the content validity, construct, and concurrent validity. Content validity is the core curricular areas and achievement specified in federal legislation. So we're talking about content that is legitimized and relevant, and there's multidimensional scaling that was used as a supplemental tool. Content validity means that it's covering the content that it intends to test for. Construct validity, there are correlations that exist between related tests, especially among correlated clusters. Kind of more generally, construct validity means that it's testing what it's intended to test. And when we're talking about correlations between related tests, that means that when we're talking about, let's say, being able to do algorithms in math, that all of the tests that cover algorithmic functions are all correlated with each other, and they're all designed to test what they intend to test, and they're all testing similar things. Concurrent validity This is where not just looking at the woodcock, but it's also looking at its validity in relation to other norm standardized tests. So several test areas correlate to other intellectual or cognitive tests like the oral and written language scales or the Kaufman test of educational achievement. What this means is that the Woodcock-Johnson tests for the same things as other cognitive tests, and the test results are in general alignment with the findings of those tests. So if they're performing, let's say, at a slightly below average level on the WJ4, they should then theoretically also be testing on a below average in a similar bandwidth for, let's say, oral and written language scales or the Kaufman test, that we're going to see a similar expression of their knowledge. We're not going to see some kid performing on slightly below average on one and then on the high end of the norm range in a different test. That means that there isn't concurrent validity. So because the WJ4 is concurrently valid, that means that we can use it and there should be similar outcomes on other exams. All right, so overall, Woodcock-Johnson is a comprehensive cognitive test that covers various aspects of reading, comprehension, language fluency, and math skills. The test is highly reliable and valid, and the results can appropriately be used to determine learning goals and objectives and to find appropriate modifications needed in IEP development. I appreciate the value that Woodcock-Johnson provides and that it is comprehensive in both English language arts and in math. And although a time-consuming examination, it's very appropriate for identification or reevaluation of learning disabilities. Like I said in the beginning, I've seen this most commonly used with high school students, because I've been teaching at the high school level for 14 years, and whenever students get evaluated or reevaluated, the Woodcock is the one that is most often used. I do not appreciate that it does not cover science in any capacity. So when I say that, I mean that you have to specifically focus on those extended battery of tests. You'd have to actually pull it on purpose in order to administer a science test. I think that the science, now granted, I teach science and I know I'm biased, but science is a very different skill than math and English language arts. There should be at least one standard battery test in science, and it's more to look at can the student interpret data? Can they analyze a diagram? Can they break down words by their root meanings? This would help to link with their English language arts skills. It would also help link to their math interpretation skills, but it's not the same as those two areas. And I think it would also help to identify students that might be dealing with some form of dysgraphia. Because we're talking about tables and images and diagrams. If students are not able to interpret them, then there's some barrier that prevents them from interpreting it. This would help to be more specific in their goal construction. I found a few reviews of the Woodcock-Johnson, and there are some general takeaways for strengths and weaknesses. So with strengths, they assess core curricular areas and achievements specified in federal legislation. There is a range of difficulty for tests which are appropriate for the population. They're useful in determining academic achievement and cognitive ability. They're developed with a nationally representative sample. Reliability and validity measures are detailed and meet minimum requirements. Test materials are well structured. And the WJ4 tests and clusters are aligned with all of the reading, writing, and math categories listed in the specific learning disability definition of the IDEA. Some weaknesses. It provides only a broad sampling of achievement areas. And this kind of goes to my point that I just made about science. It only focuses on ELA and math. A sample of skills is too limited for comprehensive instructional planning because it only focuses on ELA and math. And I'm not saying just science, but other subject areas might be undervalued when creating an IEP plan when you're only limiting yourself to ELA and math. The clusters are redundant in that they measure similar items, so the redundancy is important because it does help to maintain the validity and reliability values, but in the same breath, it's assessing the same exact things over and over again, and that redundancy might not be necessary. The WJ4 does not contain an oral language test like previous administrations. Yes, there are the specified clusters that include oral language tests. But again, they're not a part of the standard battery of tests. They're a special oral language cluster, which means, when you talk about all these different batteries and different tests, it's a different fee structure. The standard battery is a certain fee. All of the other ones have certain fee structures as well. And the WJ4 only has online scoring and data management. They don't offer a way to do scoring by hand. So it's really only if you know how to score by hand would you be able to continue that practice with WJ4. This online scoring does present privacy and confidentiality concerns, especially in if a hacking event occurs, for example. And so it could potentially be a FERPA violation. And then here are my sources.